Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating case that draws a sharp line between what's technically legal and what's ethically right, especially for a judge. It's a whole story involving a family inheritance, a pretty controversial land deal, and a judge whose every move got put under a microscope. Let's dig in and see where that line gets drawn.
So this is the big question, right? It's at the very heart of this entire story. And your first instinct is probably to say, no way, absolutely not. But as we're about to find out, the legal reality, well, it can be a lot more complicated and frankly, more surprising than you might think.
All right, so our story kicks off in a way that so many legal dramas do, with a family fighting over an inheritance.
Okay, so picture this. We're in the court of first instance of Leyte. On one side, you have Bernardita Macariola, who's the only child from her dad's first marriage. And on the other side, the kids from his second marriage. And who's presiding over this whole thing? Judge Elias Asuncion. He makes a decision, and then he later approves a formal plan, which the lawyers all agreed on, to divide up all the assets. So at this point, it really seems like the case is done and dusted.
But this is exactly where the story takes a turn. Because long after the case is closed, the judge himself gets tangled up with one of the properties from that very same case. Let's break down how this all happened.
Now you gotta notice that the property didn't just go straight from the family to the judge. Nope. There was a pretty important chain of events here. First, the Reyes children sell off a piece of their inheritance to a Dr. Arcadio Galopin. Then, about 8 months later, that same doctor sells a piece of that land to Judge Asuncion. And then finally, a year or so after that, the judge moves his share into a private corporation.
And here, right here, is where we get to the core of the problem. It wasn't just that the judge owned a piece of land. He was actually the president of this corporation, Traders Inc., which now held the title to property from a case he had personally decided. And you can imagine, that just doesn't look good. At all.
And yeah, that bad look definitely did not go unnoticed. Bernardita Macariola, the daughter from the first marriage, was furious. So she went and filed a formal complaint against the judge, which kicked off an official investigation.
So this complaint laid out 4 really specific charges. First, that the land deal itself was straight up illegal. Second, that a judge isn't even allowed to be an officer in a private company. The third charge was kind of different. It was about him being friendly with someone who was supposedly practicing law without a license. And the fourth was this big catch-all charge about his conduct in general. Now, for our story, we're really going to focus on those first 2.
So this thing goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And their job is basically to take each of these accusations and hold them up against the actual law, word for word, and see if they stick.
All right, let's tackle the biggest question first. Did Judge Asuncion actually break the law by getting his hands on that piece of the Reyes estate? Now, on the surface, the law seems crystal clear. Article 1491 of the Civil Code says judges can't buy property and rights in litigation. And that phrase right there, in litigation, is going to be absolutely key.
So what did the court say? Well, he was cleared. It all boiled down to timing. The court basically said that the rule only applies while a case is still active. Judge Asuncion bought the land more than a year after his decision was final, with no appeals filed, plus he bought it from a third party, not directly from the family. So technically speaking, the property was no longer in litigation. Legally, he was in the clear.
Okay, charge 1 is down. What about the second one? The fact that he was the president of a company while he was a sitting judge. Was that illegal?
And again, you look at the books and there seems to be a law that hits this nail right on the head. The Code of Commerce, which goes all the way back to 1888, the Spanish era, says flat out that judges cannot be involved in commerce or hold office in commercial companies. This looks like an open and shut case against him, right?
But then, the Supreme Court drops a huge legal bombshell. It turns out that this old Spanish law, it wasn't in effect anymore. Here's the crucial detail. The court said that that rule was a political law. It's a law that governs the relationship between the government and its own people. And there's this legal principle that says when a country's sovereignty changes, like it did from Spain to the US and then to the Philippines, all those old political laws just get wiped away automatically, unless the new government goes out of its way to reenact them. And this one, it was never reenacted, so poof, it was gone.
As for those other two charges, about the fake lawyer and his general conduct, the court just didn't find any real evidence to back them up, so they were tossed out too. So on all 4 counts, Judge Asuncion was found to have broken 0 laws.
But hold on, the story doesn't end there. Because for the Supreme Court, there was a massive difference between what was legal and what was proper.
See, the court then shifted its focus from the law books to something else, the canons of judicial ethics. And this canon, Canon 3, it holds judges to a way higher standard. It's not just about not doing illegal things. It's about avoiding even the appearance of doing something wrong.
And that was the final word on it. The court basically said, look, even though this judge followed the letter of the law, his actions were, and I quote, unwise and indiscreet. Buying land connected to a case he decided, even if it was indirect, it just opens the door for people to get suspicious, and it erodes public trust in the whole judicial system.
So the final verdict was this kind of split decision. On the one hand, if you look at the legal violations column, none. He broke no laws. But on the other hand, in the ethical breaches column, yeah, he crossed a line. He created an appearance of impropriety. And by investing in a business that could very well end up in his own courtroom one day, he violated another canon about making risky investments.
So after all of that, the family feud, the complicated land deals, the deep dive into Spanish-era law, what was the punishment? Pretty much a slap on the wrist. The court's final order was just to remind the judge that he needed to be a lot more careful and discreet with his business dealings in the future.
And that's what this whole case leaves us with. It's this really powerful question to think about. We obviously expect our judges to follow the law, but is that all we should expect? This case really suggests that for the whole system to work, for us to truly believe in the fairness of our courts, maybe justice has to be more than just legal. Maybe it also has to look and feel completely and totally beyond reproach.